The biting wind howled across the vast, white expanse, carrying with it the promise of a brutal winter storm. Jacob Thorne pulled the collar of his thick wool coat tighter around his neck, his breath pluming in the frigid air. Snowflakes, sharp as tiny needles, stung his weathered face. For 3 years, since the fever had stolen his wife and 2 young sons, this lonely ranch had been his entire world, a silent kingdom of grief and hard labor. The approaching Christmas Eve only sharpened the edges of his solitude, each gust of wind sounding like a mournful whisper of memories he fought daily to keep buried. He was securing the last of the shutters on the barn when he saw it, a dark shape against the stark whiteness, a smudge on the otherwise pristine canvas of the snow-covered plains. He paused, hand resting on the rough-hewn wood, his grey eyes narrowing. It wasn't a stray calf or a wandering coyote. It was too still. A cold dread, colder than the wind, snaked its way into his gut. Trouble had a way of finding a man, even one who did his best to outrun it. With a heavy sigh, he grabbed the rifle leaning against the barn door and began the trek through the knee-deep snow. As he drew closer, the shape resolved into a human form. It was a woman, collapsed in a snowdrift, a vibrant silk dress, now tattered and stained, a shocking splash of color against the endless white. She was Chinese, her features delicate but contorted in pain. Her black hair was a tangled mess, dusted with snow, and her slender frame was covered in dirt and dried blood. Vicious purple welts, the clear marks of a whip, marred the skin of her shoulders and back, visible through the torn fabric. Her wrists were still bound by a thick leather cord, a clear sign she had been held captive. Her breathing was a shallow, almost imperceptible flutter, her chest rising and falling in faint, uneven motions. Jacob leapt from the last snowdrift and dropped to his knees beside her. The cold radiating off the ground was immense, seeping through his thick trousers. But colder still was the thought that flashed through his mind. This was not random misfortune, this was a message sent from the cutthroat alleys of the nearest town's burgeoning Chinatown, a place he deliberately avoided. He knew the stories of the Tongs, of men who bought and sold women like cattle. Bringing her in was an invitation for that world to come crashing down on his isolated life. He placed 2 gloved fingers on her neck. Her pulse was a faint, thready beat, a fragile drum that felt like it might vanish at any second. If he left her here, the cold would claim her within the hour. Gritting his teeth against the wind and his own reluctance, Jacob drew the hunting knife from his belt and sliced cleanly through the leather binding her wrists. Then, with a grunt, he hoisted her into his arms. She was lighter than he expected, almost bird-like, yet a dead weight. He powered through the deepening snow, his boots sinking with each step, and carried her back towards the faint, welcoming light of his cabin. "Damn it," he muttered, the word stolen by the wind. He didn't look back. If her pursuers were watching, they would know he had interfered. This time, there would be no turning back. Jacob pushed through the rickety wooden gate of his small yard, rushing the woman, inside the cabin. He gently lowered her down, laying her on an old bearskin rug spread beside the stone fireplace, then hurried to stoke the embers. Flickering yellow light soon danced across his sun-darkened, sweat-soaked face, illuminating a space that was Spartan but clean. He dragged over a wooden bucket and scooped water from the barrel near the door, a precious resource he had to melt from snow each day. Every drop was hard-won in the deep freeze of winter. But Jacob soaked a cloth without hesitation and used it to gently wipe the grime and dried blood from her face. The pulse at her wrist was still faint, but at least it was steady. He had never been one to get tangled in other people's problems. After the fever swept through this land and took everything he loved, he had lived like a ghost, tending only to the parched land in summer and the frozen quiet in winter. He stayed away from town and even farther away from the trouble that came with other people. But what he had done tonight shattered that long-held peace. The woman before him was unlike any he had seen. Even in her weakened state, there was a resilience etched into her features. The whip marks on her back told a story of brutal punishment, likely for an act of defiance he could only imagine. Jacob knew one thing for certain. If the men who did this found out he had taken her in, they would brand him an enemy and bring their war to his doorstep. Outside, the night fell fast and heavy. The prairie wind became a gale, driving snow through the tiny cracks in the cabin walls and carrying with it the bone-deep chill of the plains. Jacob threw more logs onto the fire, the crackling flames a small rebellion against the encroaching dark. He dropped down into his worn armchair beside my. The firelight lit up his face, weathered and sun-scorched, with grey eyes that were cold but deep. He managed to coax a small amount of lukewarm broth into her, spooning it past her cracked lips. She swallowed weakly, then slipped back into unconsciousness. Jacob let out a heavy breath and pulled his rifle close, resting it within arm's reach. He leaned back against the solid wooden wall, his eyes fixed on the door, now barred against the storm and whatever human monsters might be lurking in it. He knew exactly what kind of people would leave a woman to die in the snow, and he knew they might return to finish what they had started. Tonight, if they did, Jacob Thorne would be the one standing in their way. The fire in the hearth had faded to a bed of glowing embers. Jacob dozed fitfully in his chair, the heavy Winchester resting across his lap. A faint rustling sound, the whisper of fabric on wood, snapped him awake. My! She had pushed herself into a sitting position, her dark eyes wide and wild with panic in the dim light. In an instant, her hand, surprisingly quick, snatched the small paring knife he'd left on the hearth beside a bowl of water. Steel flashed in the firelight. Jacob did not move a muscle. He slowly raised both hands, palms open, his voice a low, gravelly rumble that barely disturbed the quiet of the cabin. If you're going to stab me, try to make it clean. But if you want to live, I suggest you put the knife down. Mai was panting, beads of sweat on her forehead despite the cabin's chill. Her eyes darted around the small, old room. It was rustic, worn, but it was not a prison. Her gaze shifted back to the man in front of her, tall, lean, and unshaven, with eyes that were as steady and cold as a frozen lake. She hesitated, the knife trembling in her grip. Jacob kept his voice calm, even. I cut your bonds. I brought you out of the storm. If you want to leave, that door is open. But out there, there's nothing but a blizzard and frozen ground. You won't last an hour. The knife trembled more violently in her grip. After a long, tense pause, she let out a shuddering breath and the weapon clattered to the floorboards. Her powerful resolve seemed to desert her, and her body collapsed back onto the rug like a felled tree. Jacob stepped forward, picked up the blade, and set it on the mantel. He then handed her the bowl of water. Drink. You need it more than I do. Mai took the bowl in both hands, drinking in slow, deliberate sips. Her eyes never left Jacob's face, as if she were trying to decipher his motives, to determine if this was just a different kind of trap. Without another word, Jacob stepped out onto the covered porch and sat on the top step, his rifle resting across his lap once more. The wind whipped snow around him, but he seemed oblivious to the cold. Mai tilted her head, watching his silhouette through the open doorway. In the faint moonlight that filtered through the storm clouds, the man remained as still as stone. The only movement was the faint orange glow of his cigarette and the wisps of smoke curling away into the raging blizzard. That entire night, Mai did not truly sleep. Each time the nightmares of her past came rushing back, she would jolt awake, her heart pounding. And each time, she would open her eyes and see Jacob still there, a silent sentinel, never coming back inside, but never leaving his post either. A strange, unfamiliar feeling began to stir in her chest, something she thought had been beaten out of her long ago, a sense of safety. By the time the sky began to pale into a greyish dawn, the storm had lessened, and Jacob had not moved. He simply turned his head, his voice quiet but clear over the wind. If you want to stay until you're strong again, you can. If you want to leave, I won't stop you. The choice is yours. Mai stared at his back. Then she turned her face away, pulling the thick wool blanket he had given her tighter around her shoulders. She said nothing, but her silence was her answer. The sun rose, casting a weak, watery light down on the snow-laden roof of the cabin. A few days had passed, and Mai could now stand on her own, moving with a pained stiffness but a determined gait. She stepped out into the yard, her shoulders still roughly bandaged, but her gaze sharp and focused. The world was a blinding expanse of white, the air crisp and clean after the storm. Jacob was splitting firewood, the rhythmic thud of his axe the only sound in the quiet morning. He didn't bother to look up. "You're stronger," he stated, his tone even. "If you want to earn your keep, the animals in the barn need water." Mai said nothing, but a moment later she picked up 2 wooden buckets and made her way to the barn. Her arms, though slender, flexed with a surprising strength as she worked the hand pump for the well, the iron groaning in protest against the cold. Jacob glanced over, a flicker of surprise in his eyes. The woman who had been at death's door just days before was already strong enough to work. That day, Mai said almost nothing, simply following Jacob in silence, watching how he mended a broken stall door and mixed feed for the cattle. As the afternoon faded and Jacob finally paused to rest, leaning against a post and rolling a cigarette, she suddenly stepped forward, picked up the hammer he had set down, and finished driving in the last few nails. Jacob stood still for a moment, observing her efficient, powerful movements. He gave a quiet nod of acknowledgement and let her carry on. That evening, for the first time, Mai lit the kitchen stove without being asked. She prepared a simple but hearty stew from the rabbit Jacob had trapped, and set a steaming bowl down in front of him without a word. He looked at the bowl, then at her face, which was still guarded but no longer filled with panic. A silent nod was all the thanks he offered, but it was enough. In the days that followed, the suffocating silence of the cabin was replaced by the sounds of shared labor. The thud of the axe, the scraping of shovels clearing paths in the snow, the quiet murmur of 2 people existing in the same small space. Jacob cleared a new path to the barn. Mai, with a strength that continued to astonish him, hauled firewood and stacked it neatly on the porch. She rebuilt an entire section of a collapsed fence in just one afternoon, her movements precise and tireless. One evening, as the last rays of sunlight painted the snow-covered peaks in hues of orange and pink, the 2 of them sat on the front porch. Jacob lit a cigarette, the smoke a fleeting ghost in the cold air. Mai was sharpening the small knife she had once pulled on him, her hand steady and sure. For the first time, she spoke, her voice soft but clear. "Why did you save me?" Jacob stared out at the vast, frozen fields, a landscape that mirrored the barrenness he often felt inside. "Because I couldn't bear to see someone left out there to the cold. I've seen too much death." Mai was silent. After a moment, she nodded. It was a simple answer, but it seemed to be the one she needed. Something inside her, coiled tight with suspicion and fear, began to loosen. That night, as the wind rustled through the old pines at the edge of the property, Mai no longer tossed and turned. For the first time in months, she slept a deep, dreamless sleep. Outside the cabin, Jacob's slow, steady footsteps continued their circular patrol, a quiet vigil under the cold, silent stars. A week before Christmas, the sky turned a harsh, metallic grey. Jacob was tightening the saddle on his old horse when the sound of hoofbeats echoed in the distance, muffled by the thick blanket of snow. His head snapped up. On the horizon, a faint trail of disturbed snow was growing larger. Uninvited guests. "Get inside," Jacob muttered, grabbing the Winchester he now kept propped by the door. Mai heard the sound from the barn and stepped outside. The moment she saw the riders, she froze, a bucket dropping from her hand and landing softly in the snow. 3 Chinese men on horseback reined in at the entrance to the ranch. Their faces were grim, their eyes as cold as the wind. They wore thick, dark coats over traditional clothing, and each man had a pistol holstered at his hip. The one in front, a man with a long, thin scar bisecting his left eyebrow, nudged his horse forward. He spoke in clipped, broken English, his voice flat and devoid of emotion. "We have come for what is ours. The woman is here. Hand her over." Mai took a step back, her hand instinctively gripping the small knife she now kept tucked in her belt. Jacob stepped forward, placing himself between the cabin door and the riders, the rifle held steady in his hands. "She's in my care now. She stays here." Another rider snarled, his voice rising with impatience. "She belongs to the dragon head of the Tong. She was to be his wife. She has shamed him by running. If you shelter her, you become our enemy." Jacob did not lower his gun. His grey eyes were cold steel. If you want her, you'll have to go through me first. The silence that followed was as taut as a drawn bowstring. The wind kicked up flurries of snow, swirling around the horse's hooves. From behind Jacob, Mai stared at his back, his face calm, but his shoulders tense, ready to fire at the first wrong move. She saw a man who had every reason to turn her out, to save his own skin, yet he stood as firm and unyielding as the mountains behind them. Finally, the lead warrior with the scar lowered his gaze, his eyes burning with a cold fury. "We will return," he hissed. "And next time, we will not come to talk." Christmas Eve. The dragon-head will have his prize by then. They yanked their reins and galloped off, leaving behind a trail of churned-up snow and a heavy, suffocating silence in the yard. Mai gripped her knife so tightly her knuckles turned white. Jacob turned back toward her, the fire of confrontation still flickering in his eyes. "They'll come back with more," he said quietly. "If you still want to stay, we have to prepare." Mai met his gaze and nodded, her own eyes now lit with a different kind of fire. It was not fear, but the burning, unyielding will to survive. That night, Jacob lit every lantern in the cabin and dragged out every round of ammunition he possessed, along with old grain sacks he could fill with dirt to reinforce the windows. Mai stood beside him, sleeves rolled up, helping him barricade the windows and build up defenses in the yard. For the first time since she had arrived, she was no longer just a refugee seeking shelter. She had chosen her ground, and she would stand with him for the battle to come. The days leading up to Christmas Eve were a blur of frantic preparation. The air grew colder, and a sense of impending doom hung over the small ranch, as thick as the morning frost. Jacob taught Mai how to load and fire his spare shotgun, his hands briefly covering hers as he showed her how to aim. She was a quick study, her movements economical and her focus absolute. They worked together in a seamless, unspoken rhythm, chopping extra wood, securing the livestock, and turning the small cabin into a makeshift fortress. On the morning of Christmas Eve, the sky was a low, oppressive sheet of grey. Snow began to fall, not in gentle flakes, but in a thick, blinding curtain. The blizzard they had feared was upon them. By midday, the world outside the cabin was a swirling vortex of white. "They'll use the storm for cover," Jacob said, peering through a small crack in a boarded-up window. "Then we will use it too," Mai replied, her voice steady. She had tied her hair back and was dressed in a pair of Jacob's old trousers and a thick woolen shirt. In her hands, she held the shotgun, her stance that of a warrior ready for battle. The sound, when it came, was almost lost in the howl of the wind, the muffled thud of horses struggling through deep snow. Soon, dark figures emerged from the swirling whiteness, nearly a dozen of them, surrounding the ranch in a tight, menacing circle. The air grew thick with the smell of wet wool and impending violence. The man with the scar dismounted, his men following suit, their pistols drawn. "Thorn," he yelled, his voice carrying over the wind. "The dragon-head is patient, but his patience has ended. Send out the woman, and he may let you live to see Christmas morning." Jacob stood by the door, his Winchester leveled. "She's not going anywhere," he shouted back. A gunshot cracked, splintering the wood next to his head. The siege had begun. For hours, the battle raged. Gunshots echoed through the blizzard, flashes of orange fire illuminating the ghostly white landscape. Jacob was a crack shot, his years of solitude and hunting paying off as he picked off riders who dared to venture too close. But it was Mai who was the true surprise. She moved with a silent, deadly grace, firing the shotgun with a force that sent attackers reeling. When one managed to break through a window, she met him not with the gun, but with her small knife, a blur of motion that ended with the man gurgling on the cabin floor. As darkness fell, the attack intensified. They tried to set fire to the barn, but the wet, snow-covered wood refused to catch. They charged the cabin, but were met with a hail of lead. Inside, Jacob and Mai fought side by side, a well-oiled machine of survival. In the heat of the battle, he saw not a fragile victim, but a partner, a fighter whose spirit was as strong as any man's. Finally, as the first faint hints of dawn approached, the attack faltered. The remaining men, battered and fewer in number, retreated back into the storm, their threats swallowed by the wind. A deep, Profound silence fell over the ranch, broken only by the whistling wind and their own ragged breaths. The blizzard had begun to subside. At dawn on Christmas morning, the sky cleared to a deep, burnished bronze. The world was reborn, covered in a fresh, untouched blanket of snow. The battle was over. Jacob leaned against the wall, exhausted but alive. Mai stood by the window, the shotgun still held loosely in her hands, her face smudged with gunpowder but her eyes shining with a fierce, triumphant light. He looked at her, his voice low and raspy. "It's over. By morning, everything will have changed." "Are you sure about this?" Mai met his eyes, her gaze burning with an unquenchable fire. "I already died once out there in the snow. I will not die again." Jacob nodded, a slow smile touching his lips for the first time in years. He understood. She hadn't just been fighting for her life, she had been fighting for the right to choose it. Later that morning, the sun broke through, casting a brilliant, dazzling light across the snow. The scent of pine and clean, cold air filled the cabin. After weeks of struggle and fear, the first drops of a thaw began to fall from the cabin's eaves. Elias stood on the porch, the warm sun on his face. He watched the cracked, frozen field slowly begin to soften under the light. Mai stepped out behind him, her dark hair wild in the gentle breeze. The storm had passed, both outside and within. "They won't be back," Elias said slowly. "They won't hunt you anymore. The road south still leads to town." Mai turned to him, her eyes calm but deep. "And do you want me to leave?" Elias was quiet for a long moment, the warmth of the sun seeping into his weary bones. Finally, he shook his head, a genuine smile gracing his lips. "No. I think this ranch. It's no longer big enough for just one person." A faint, beautiful smile crossed Mai's lips, the first true smile he had seen since the day he saved her. That whole afternoon, the two worked side by side, clearing the debris from the yard, tending to the animals, and repairing the damage to their small fortress. Mai carried the heaviest logs. Jacob drove the posts. By the time the sun began to set on Christmas Day, the ranch looked different, stronger, cleaner, and filled with the quiet promise of a new beginning. When night came, Jacob lit a fire in the hearth. They sat beside it, watching the sparks drift up the chimney. For the first time in 3 long years, Jacob did not feel alone. The ghosts of his past were still there, but now, they were joined by a new, living presence. Mai laid her knife on the mantel, a silent promise. Jacob looked at her, the firelight casting her face in a warm glow, strong and peaceful. "In my old life," she said softly, her voice still rough but proud, "I was taught that a woman cannot live without a man to own her. That she is nothing without a husband." She paused, her gaze meeting his. "But you have shown me that a woman can live with a man who stands beside her?" Jacob nodded, his heart full. "Tomorrow," he said, his voice thick with emotion, "we build a new fence." Mai nodded back, her smile widening. In the quiet of the night, all that remained was the smell of wood smoke and the feeling that something new, something strong and resilient, had finally begun. Sometimes, we do not get to choose where we are born, or the hardships we must face. But we can choose where we make our stand. And sometimes, choosing to stand beside someone else means daring to stand against the entire world. In that very moment, when two lost souls decide not to walk away from each other, a true home is built, not just from wood and nails, but from courage, trust, and the shared warmth of a Christmas fire.